A young man stood at the edge of a clearing in the jungle, poised between two trees, as if perhaps he was unsure, or maybe he was just waiting. As it happens, it was rather a mixture of both. A small sound had reached his ears an instant before, a sound like a soft padded footstep, the sound of some jungle hunter, he was sure, but hunting what? Well, that was the question. He pondered and listened and waited, waited. It must have seemed like forever as the seconds ticked by. One of his hands rested against the tree to his left, where he had placed it the moment before he had paused, with the intention of steadying himself as he passed between them, and where it had remained since he had frozen. He felt the moss and the wet and the tree bark beneath his hand, and the muddy mix of dead and living plants and unidentifiable goo that made up the ground beneath his boots. He was attempting to keep perfectly still, to listen, and to observe his surroundings as fully as possible without giving his position away, but his tail persisted in twitching and swishing slightly back and forth, as it always did when he was agitated, an unconscious habit that he had never quite learned to control. Soon enough, however, the hunter came into view. Some sort of jungle cat, it seemed, though not of any manner the young man had ever seen before, but, having little experience with jungles, he was less critical of its appearance than it seemed to be of his. The cat sniffed upon seeing him, and stared a little, raising a paw uncertainly, holding it in the air a moment, and then equally hesitantly putting it down again as it considered him. He considered it with far less apparent interest, and indeed less curiosity, but with many more practical motives, as suited his character. Likely, had there been an unbiased observer present, they would easily have agreed that both had more than ample cause to study each other. The cat was rather exotic in appearance, at least outside of this particular planet's standards, and the boy equally if not more so, for he had no planet in which his appearance would be considered normal, or at least if he had, he certainly didn't know it. The cat was primarily a silvery gray color, with a mix of lavender and violet stripes on its back, and an ivory underbelly, extending up its neck into facial markings, and down, covering its lower legs and splashing onto its large paws. It had eyes of a deep cerulean blue, remarkably intelligent, and clearer than a cloudless summer sky. Its body was sleek and muscular, its fur thick, and its aura was simply magnificent. Even so, the youth was no less interesting to look at, with bright turquoise hair framing his face and spilling down his back, not quite reaching his waist, and strange, almond-shaped eyes almost of a shade with it, but with slitted pupils and irises large enough they nearly obscured the sclera. The large black and leathery wings protruding from his back had necessitated long slits in his coat. Another slit up the middle from the bottom made comfortable room for his equally black tail. His skin was dark, although not near the inky shade of his wings or tail, and of a human-looking brown, but his fingernails looked sharp, and seemed remarkably well defined. If he had opened his mouth, one could perhaps have caught a glimpse of equally sharp canines, but as he didn't, the presence of such can only be speculated, not confirmed. After both had spent some time admiring each other thus, the cat determined it had learned enough, and deciding that this creature was clearly not food, it simply licked its chops once, groomed itself a little, and continued on its way. The boy slowly let out a deep breath once it was gone, though his face had remained composed the whole time. It had not been a small cat. He remained still a few moments longer, closing his eyes and letting waves of calm wash over him, slowing the beating of his heart. Then he simply continued on as he had intended before, acting as if he had never been interrupted. He freed his boots from the clinging earth with a soft sucking sound, and walked on. He had been walking a great deal lately. It seemed almost all he had been doing besides flying and running, and hiding. Always now he seemed to be hiding, and he hated it. Admittedly, it wasn't like his life had been anywhere near anything resembling his wishes for it in a very long time now. But, despite his normally haughty and aloof behavior, he had never felt so alone as he had begun to feel since escaping. He hadn't really considered before how much comfort there was simply in knowing you were part of a team. Even a team filled with lies and hatred and betrayal seemed better than this isolation and loneliness. However, being as he was rather more logically than emotionally inclined, the young man chose not to dwell on it. Such feelings did him no good, and he knew that in all likelihood they would soon pass anyway. Still, it was hard to come up with anything useful to think about when making one's way through trackless jungle, with no real destination but away, and no way of knowing even what destinations might be available to choose from. His thoughts wandered aimlessly with nothing to hold them, half trying to make plans, although already knowing he would not be able to come up with something better than the one he was already following. Keep moving, and stay lost until you can find a way off the planet. That being a given, the only thing left to consider was how to get off said planet, without getting caught. It wasn't the first time he had cursed his distinctive appearance, but it certainly was one of the most heartfelt. Time seemed to pass strangely in the jungle, at least different than what the boy was used to. Absently, he wondered if that was more due to this constant unregulated outdoor environment, the lack of people, or perhaps the lack of any particular schedule. Equally absently, he wondered if he would get used to it if he stayed there long enough, and how long that long enough might be. With slightly more interest, he tried to calculate how long he might be able to survive like this. The constant on-again, off-again dance with adrenaline was beginning to take a serious toll on his mind and body. The fact that he hadn't really eaten anything for several days certainly was no help, and the constant stinging and itching of bug bites was slowly driving him crazy. It was just a feeling that caught his attention this time. A tension in the air, a stillness all around. He froze, just as before, caught in mid-step, with his twitching tail betraying him, despite his best efforts to control it. He stood in silence, far more tense than he had been the first time, his eyes flickering every which way, all his senses extended as far as they could go, searching urgently for any potential threat. The jungle should not have been so quiet on its own. There must be something, he knew, and he drew upon all the strength of his soul to control the fear, to change it into energy he could use when the time came. If it came. He stood, and again he waited, searching, finding nothing but the unnatural, silent stillness. Nothing happened. Slowly he began to move, inching forward, step by agonizing step, his eyes constantly roving, his head never still, searching even as he walked. He knew the danger was lurking somewhere, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, unless it had struck already. A moving target is harder to hit, but easier to see. Something was out there. He hoped he would find it before it found him. And yet, the role of the hunter excited him. After years of being hunted and caged, finally, he was hunting again. His eyes glowed with the light of his anticipation. A tiny smile curved his lips. He flexed his hands and knew his claws were ready. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he was aware that he had been afraid just moments before. But not now. Not now. He was alive. He was free. And he would win. This was a challenge, and the boy who had been called Crucifix never accepted anything less than victory. Never. Perhaps he was lucky, or maybe his arrogant confidence was more deserved than his apparent age and stature led people to expect. Whatever the case may be, it wasn't long before he found what he was looking for. Admittedly, once found, it did not seem like it should have been particularly difficult to track, although it did seem to be somehow almost unnaturally stealthy despite its size. It must have been in order to have only attracted his attention because of the silence. It was a great hulking behemoth of a creature, with leathery greenish-blue skin, perhaps scaly. It was hard to tell in the semi-dark beneath the thick jungle canopy, especially with all the moss stains and streaks of dirt covering its already almost camel-patterned hide. It had short, stumpy legs with enormous feet, and its face was defined by small eyes and a large, slightly rounded snout. Its mouth looked to be full of rows upon rows of razor-sharp teeth. Then suddenly that beast turned his direction. Its eyes locked on him, and its nostrils flared. He silently cursed his tail for its stubborn refusal to accept silent stillness, but he had no time to dwell on it as the creature charged. He hoped his small size and speed would be to his advantage as he dodged around behind a tree. He wondered how thick the creature's hide was, how powerful were its jaws, and jumped as far as he could away from the falling tree before he even realized what he was doing. The monster was far stronger than he had expected. He was a little ashamed to be grateful and relieved when the great beast seemed stunned by the blow it had dealt the tree. It shook itself, tried to regain its bearings. Then, to his honest but foolish disappointment, it turned, starting to just wander away, apparently having forgotten him. He considered, and might have actually pursued it, if the fallen tree hadn't suddenly let out a strange, mewling, whimpering sound, followed by the most pathetic growl he had ever heard in his life. Distracted from the departing monster, Crucifix moved to examine the tree. He doubted that the noises came from the tree itself, which meant they must be coming from something in the tree. He found himself quite curious as to what that thing was. After a short period of examination, he found that the tree had fallen in just such a way that some of its branches had formed a kind of natural cage, and when he knelt to examine it closer, a pair of indignant indigo eyes stared up at him from within. It seemed he had found the source of the strange noises.